June 19, 1944. A sweltering tent on the edge of Saipan, Mariana Islands. Sergeant Thomas Mercer pressed the headphones tighter against his ears, his knuckles white around the pencil stub. The static hissed like angry snakes, the same static that had made every other radio operator in the tent throw their hands up in frustration. The same static that had made Captain Holloway call him a fool 3 days earlier when he presented his contraption. A radio receiver cobbled together from salvaged parts, rewired in a way that violated every manual the Signal Corps had ever printed. "Mercer's chasing ghosts again," someone muttered behind him, but Thomas was not listening to them. He was listening to something else entirely. Beneath the static, buried like a heartbeat under layers of white noise, there it was. A pattern. Japanese. Clear as a church bell on a Sunday morning. His hand moved across the paper so fast, the pencil tip snapped. He grabbed another without looking up. The coordinates, fleet movements, a carrier group repositioning northwest. In that moment, as sweat dripped from his jaw onto the transcript, Thomas Mercer understood something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The men who had laughed at him, who had called his modifications junk, who had reported him to Captain Holloway for insubordination, those men were about to owe him their lives. And so were the 15,000 Marines preparing to land on the beaches of Saipan the following morning. What they did not know, what no one knew yet, was that the Imperial Japanese Navy had changed their encryption frequency 3 weeks earlier. Every Allied listening post in the Pacific had gone deaf overnight. Every post except one broken radio in a canvas tent, operated by a sergeant from rural Ohio, who had learned electronics by taking apart his father's tractors. If you are watching from anywhere in the world, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We bring you stories from World War II that reveal the painful, complicated, and sometimes extraordinary side of humanity. Stories of people whose names never made the history books, but whose courage shaped the world we live in today. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and let us remember these stories together. Thomas Andrew Mercer was born in 1919 in a farmhouse outside of Dayton, Ohio, the kind of place where the nearest neighbor was a 20-minute walk through cornfields, and the only sounds at night were crickets and the occasional train whistle from miles away. His father, William Mercer, was a practical man who believed that anything broken could be fixed if you understood how it worked. Before Thomas could read, he could identify the parts of a tractor engine by touch. By the time he was 8, he had disassembled and reassembled the family radio, a hulking Philco Cathedral model that his mother, Dorothy, had saved 6 months to afford. Dorothy had been furious when she found the radio in pieces on the kitchen table, vacuum tubes lined up like soldiers, wires coiled in neat spirals. But William had simply pulled up a chair and said, "Well, son, you took it apart. Now let us see if you can put it back together." It took Thomas 4 hours. When he plugged it in and the voice of a Cincinnati announcer crackled through the speaker, his mother had wept, though she never admitted whether it was from relief or from something else, some glimpse of who her son might become. By the time Thomas was 16, he was known throughout the county as the boy who could fix anything electrical. Farmers brought him broken generators. The general store owner paid him 50 cents to repair a cash register. The local doctor asked him to look at an X-ray machine that had stopped working, and Thomas had traced the fault to a single burned-out capacitor, which he replaced using a part salvaged from an old car radio. He never went to college. There was no money for that, and besides, by 1939, the world had other plans for young men from Ohio. When the draft notice arrived in March 1942, Thomas was 23 years old. He had spent the previous 3 years working at a small radio repair shop in Dayton, saving money, courting a girl named Ellen from the church choir, and listening to the news from Europe with a growing sense of dread. The Army, upon learning of his background, assigned him to the Signal Corps. Basic training at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, was a blur of marching, shooting, and classroom instruction on military communications equipment. Thomas found the coursework almost insultingly simple. The instructors taught by the book, literally. They read from manuals and expected the soldiers to memorize procedures without understanding principles. Thomas understood principles. He understood that radio waves behaved according to physical laws. that frequencies could be filtered and amplified in ways the manuals never discussed, that the official equipment was designed for reliability and mass production, not for optimal performance. He kept these observations to himself, mostly. The Army did not reward creativity. The Army rewarded obedience. In September 1943, Thomas shipped out to the Pacific Theater. His first posting was a listening station in New Caledonia, a French island territory that had become a crucial Allied base. The work was tedious but important, monitoring Japanese radio traffic, logging frequencies, transcribing anything that sounded significant, and passing it up the chain to the cryptanalysts. The equipment was adequate. Standard-issue receivers, well-maintained, capable of picking up transmissions across a range of frequencies. Thomas did his job competently, earned no commendations and no reprimands, and spent his free time writing letters to Ellen and tinkering with broken equipment that other operators had discarded. It was in New Caledonia that he first began to notice the patterns. Japanese military communications followed certain rhythms. Transmissions tended to cluster at specific times of day. Certain frequencies were favored during certain operations. When a major offensive was being planned, the volume of traffic increased in predictable ways, not the content, which was encrypted, but the sheer amount of chatter. Thomas began keeping a personal log, noting not just the content of intercepted messages, but the meta patterns, timing, frequency choices, signal strength, duration. His superiors did not ask for this information, so he did not volunteer it, but he filled 3 notebooks with observations over the course of 8 months. In May 1944, he was transferred to a forward listening post, being established on Saipan, in anticipation of the upcoming invasion. The Mariana Islands campaign was going to be one of the largest operations of the Pacific War, a stepping stone toward Japan itself. Intelligence would be crucial. Thomas arrived on June 12th, 1 week before the main landings were scheduled. The listening post was a collection of tents on a hillside overlooking the ocean, hastily erected by advance teams who had secured the position after preliminary bombardments. The equipment had been shipped from Hawaii. Newer receivers, better antennas, the latest in American military communications technology. There was only one problem. The Japanese had changed everything. The first sign of trouble came on June 13th, the day after Thomas arrived. Lieutenant Harold Vance, the officer in charge of the listening post, gathered the 12 radio operators for a briefing. "Gentlemen, we have a situation," Vance said. He was a thin man with a pencil mustache and a nervous habit of tapping his fingers against his thigh. "As of approximately 3 weeks ago, Japanese naval communications have gone dark. Our stations across the Pacific, Pearl Harbor, Midway, New Caledonia, all of them, are reporting the same thing. We cannot pick up their fleet transmissions." A murmur went through the tent. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "Intelligence believes they have changed their primary frequencies," Vance continued. "They may have also altered their encryption protocols. Our cryptanalysts are working on it, but in the meantime, we are flying blind. Our orders are to sweep every frequency band around the clock until we re-establish contact. Any questions?" There were many questions, but no good answers. For the next 4 days, Thomas and his fellow operators worked in shifts, scanning the airwaves with methodical desperation. They found commercial traffic. They found weather reports. They found Allied transmissions bouncing around the Pacific. But of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the fleet that intelligence believed was repositioning for a major counterattack, they heard nothing. Thomas reviewed his notebooks from New Caledonia. The patterns he had observed suggested that the Japanese favored certain frequency ranges for fleet communications, certain times of day for high-priority transmissions. But when he tuned to those ranges at those times, he heard only static, not silence. Static. There was a difference. On the evening of June 16th, Thomas approached Lieutenant Vance with a theory. "Sir, I do not believe they have changed to a frequency outside our range. I believe they are still transmitting in the same general band, but with modifications that our receivers are filtering out as noise." Vance looked at him with undisguised skepticism. "Explain." Thomas tried to put into simple terms something he understood intuitively. "Our receivers are designed to lock onto clean signals and reject interference. It is a feature. It makes it easier to isolate transmissions in a crowded band. But what if the Japanese have deliberately degraded their signal quality, added noise to their own transmissions so they sound like static to our equipment? That would make their own communications harder to receive. Yes, sir. But they would know what frequencies to monitor. They would know what the noise pattern sounds like. They could filter it on their end. We cannot, because we do not know the pattern. Vance was silent for a moment. What are you proposing, Sergeant? I would like permission to modify one of the spare receivers, remove some of the filtering circuits, widen the sensitivity range. If I am right, I might be able to pick up what we have been missing. The lieutenant shook his head slowly. Sergeant Mercer, that equipment is government property. I cannot authorize you to dismantle it based on a theory. Sir, with respect, we have 3 days until the main landings. If there is a Japanese fleet out there preparing to intercept our transports, I am aware of the stakes. Vance cut him off. Request denied. Return to your station. Thomas returned to his station. He scanned frequencies for another 2 hours, heard nothing but static, and made a decision that could have ended his military career. At 0200 on June 17th, while most of the camp was asleep, he retrieved a broken receiver from the equipment tent, a unit that had been marked for disposal after a power surge had damaged its main circuit board. He carried it to a supply tent behind the latrines, lit a kerosene lamp and began to work. He did not sleep that night or the next. He had no proper tools, so he improvised. A pocket knife for a screwdriver, a bent paperclip for a probe, a piece of wire from a ration crate for soldering connections. He removed the automatic gain control circuit, which was designed to normalize signal strength. He bypassed 2 of the 3 intermediate frequency filters. He rewired the antenna input to accept a broader range of impedances. The result was a receiver that, by any official standard, should not have worked at all. It had no selectivity. It had no stability. It would pick up everything: lightning strikes, engine noise, Allied transmissions, Japanese transmissions, cosmic radiation for all Thomas knew, but it would not reject anything as noise. On the morning of June 18th, Thomas connected his contraption to a spare antenna and put on the headphones. The sound was overwhelming, a roaring ocean of electromagnetic interference, dozens of signals overlapping, static layered on static. Any sane operator would have ripped off the headphones after 30 seconds. Thomas closed his eyes and listened. Somewhere in that chaos he knew there was a pattern. He had spent 2 years learning to hear patterns. He had spent his whole life understanding how things worked beneath the surface. At 08:47, he heard it. A rhythmic pulse beneath the noise, not random, structured, deliberate. He began to write. The first intercept was fragmentary, a partial call sign, a bearing, what might have been a speed notation. Thomas logged it anyway, noted the frequency and time, and kept listening. 20 minutes later, he caught another fragment, then another. By noon, he had filled 6 pages of notes. The transmissions were coming from multiple sources, all using the same noise-masking technique, all operating within a frequency band that standard Allied receivers would have dismissed as dead air. Thomas understood what he was hearing. This was not random traffic. This was coordination. Multiple vessels communicating with a central command, exchanging position updates, receiving orders. A fleet. He needed to tell someone. But he also knew what would happen if he walked into Lieutenant Vance's tent with a stack of handwritten notes from an unauthorized jury-rigged receiver. He would be dismissed, possibly disciplined. The intelligence would be ignored or delayed while his superiors decided whether to believe him. There was no time for that. At 1400, Thomas intercepted a transmission that made his blood run cold. It was longer than the others, more detailed. He could not read the encryption, but he recognized enough of the format, the headers, the structure, the call signs, to understand its significance. This was an operational order, fleet-wide, imminent. He grabbed his notes and ran. Captain James Holloway was the senior intelligence officer on Saipan, a career military man who had served in the Pacific since 1942. He was known for 2 things: an absolute insistence on proper procedure and an absolute intolerance for what he called creative interpretation of intelligence. When Thomas burst into his tent, breathless and sweating, Holding a sheaf of papers and babbling about modified receivers and noise-masked frequencies, Holloway's expression shifted from surprise to irritation to something approaching anger. "Sergeant, are you telling me you dismantled government equipment without authorization?" "Sir, yes, but—" "And you are claiming to have intercepted Japanese naval communications that every listening post in the Pacific has failed to detect?" "Sir, if you would just look at the transcripts—" Holloway did not look at the transcripts. He looked at Thomas with the weariness of a man who had seen too many young soldiers convinced of their own brilliance. "Sergeant Mercer, I have been receiving reports from Pearl Harbor, from Midway, from stations operated by men with years more experience than you, all telling me the same thing. The Japanese have successfully blinded us, and you expect me to believe that you alone with a broken radio and a theory have cracked it?" "I expect you to verify it, sir. Send the coordinates to reconnaissance. If I am wrong, you can court-martial me. But if I am right, that is not how intelligence works, Sergeant. We do not act on the hunches of individual operators. We corroborate. We analyze. We do not have time," Thomas shouted. He had never shouted at a superior officer in his life. The tent went very quiet. Holloway's face hardened. "You are dismissed, Sergeant. Report to Lieutenant Vance. I will decide later what to do with you." Thomas walked out of the tent feeling like a man watching his own execution. He had tried. He had failed. Whatever was about to happen, to the fleet, to the Marines, to the invasion, he had tried. He returned to his modified receiver. If he was going to be court-martialed anyway, he might as well keep listening. Over the next 8 hours, Thomas intercepted 14 more transmissions. He logged them all meticulously. Time, frequency, estimated bearing based on signal strength, content fragments. He organized them into a timeline, cross-referencing call signs, building a picture of fleet movements. By midnight on June 18th, he had mapped what he believed was the disposition of a major Japanese naval force. At least 4 carriers, multiple battleships, dozens of escorts, all converging on a position northwest of the Marianas, all preparing for what could only be a massive counterattack against the American invasion fleet. He wrote a summary report. He attached the transcripts. He placed the package in an envelope, and at 0300 on June 19th, he walked to Captain Holloway's tent and slipped it under the flap. Then he returned to his receiver and waited for dawn. The morning of June 19th, 1944, would later be known as the beginning of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, one of the largest naval engagements in history. But as the sun rose over Saipan, Thomas Mercer knew nothing of the larger strategic picture. He knew only that his headphones were alive with Japanese transmissions, more urgent now, more frequent, the noise-masked signals overlapping in a frenzy of coordination. At 07:30, Lieutenant Vance appeared at the entrance to Thomas's tent. His face was pale. "Sergeant Mercer, Captain Holloway wants to see you. Immediately." Thomas removed his headphones. He expected to see MPs waiting outside, ready to escort him to detention. Instead, Vance was alone, and his expression was not anger. It was something closer to fear. In Holloway's tent, a map had been unrolled on a folding table. Red markers indicated Japanese positions that matched almost exactly the coordinates Thomas had logged in his transcripts. A Navy commander Thomas did not recognize stood beside Holloway, his face grim. "Sergeant Mercer," Holloway said. His voice was different now, quieter, stripped of its earlier dismissiveness. "Commander Ashworth, Naval Intelligence. He arrived an hour ago from the flagship." Ashworth stepped forward. "Son, I need you to tell me exactly how you built that receiver and exactly what you have been hearing." Thomas told them everything, the modifications, the theory about noise masking, the patterns he had observed over months of listening in New Caledonia, the 61 separate intercepts he had logged over the past 3 days. When he finished, Ashworth was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to Holloway. "Captain, I need this man and his equipment on a transport to the Lexington within the hour, and I need his transcripts coded and transmitted to Admiral Mitcher immediately." Holloway nodded. If he felt any shame about his earlier dismissal of Thomas, he did not show it. There was no time for that. "Sergeant," Ashworth said, "you may have just saved the Fifth Fleet." The Battle of the Philippine Sea unfolded over 2 days, June 19th and 20th, 1944. It would be called the greatest carrier battle of the Pacific War, a decisive American victory that broke the back of Japanese naval aviation. Thomas Mercer experienced it from the communications center of the USS Lexington, one of the fleet's aircraft carriers. He wore borrowed Navy headphones and hunched over his modified receiver, which the ship's radio technicians had examined with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. One of them, a chief petty officer named Kowalski, had called it the ugliest piece of equipment I have ever seen that actually works. The intelligence Thomas provided was not the only factor in the American victory. The Japanese attack plan had been compromised by other means as well: captured documents, interrogated prisoners, traffic analysis from other sources. But Thomas's intercepts had provided something the other intelligence lacked: real-time updates. As the Japanese fleet launched its aircraft on the morning of June 19th, Thomas tracked the transmissions between carriers and their air groups. He heard the orders going out, the acknowledgements coming back. He could not read the encryption, but he could count the call signs, estimate the size of the attacking force, and, most critically, track the frequency shifts that indicated when squadrons were being redirected or recalled. He relayed this information to Commander Ashworth, who relayed it to the flag bridge, where Admiral Mitcher used it to position his fighters and direct his combat air patrols. The result was what American pilots would later call the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot. Japanese aircraft, attacking in waves, were intercepted and destroyed before they could reach the American carriers. Over the course of the day, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost approximately 350 aircraft, the majority of its remaining carrier aviation strength. Thomas did not see any of this. He did not watch the dogfights overhead or the anti-aircraft guns filling the sky with tracers. He sat in a steel compartment below decks, headphones clamped to his ears, writing furiously on a pad of paper, listening to the enemy die. At one point, during a lull in the transmissions, he removed his headphones and noticed that his hands were shaking. He was not sure if it was fear or exhaustion or something else, some emotion he did not have a name for. A sailor brought him coffee. It was the best coffee he had ever tasted. On the second day, American aircraft located and attacked the retreating Japanese fleet, sinking carriers and destroying more planes. The battle was effectively over. The Japanese combined fleet, already weakened by years of attrition, had been crippled beyond recovery. Thomas continued monitoring transmissions until June 21st, when Commander Ashworth finally ordered him to rest. By that point, he had been awake for nearly 60 hours. He slept for 14 hours straight, in a bunk below the waterline, and dreamed of static. The war did not end with the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Thomas Mercer spent another 14 months in the Pacific, transferred to a special intelligence unit that had been hastily assembled to exploit the techniques he had developed. His modified receiver design was documented, improved, and eventually manufactured in small numbers for use by forward listening posts across the theater. He was promoted to technical sergeant, received a Bronze Star for his contributions to the Saipan operation, and was mentioned in classified reports that would remain sealed for decades. He never received public recognition. The details of signals intelligence were too sensitive to acknowledge openly. The war ended in August 1945. Thomas was on Okinawa when the news came, preparing for what everyone assumed would be the invasion of Japan itself. He listened to the announcement of the atomic bombs on a standard-issue radio, no modifications necessary, and felt nothing he could articulate. Relief, perhaps. Exhaustion, certainly. Something like grief for reasons he did not fully understand. He shipped home in November 1945 and arrived in San Francisco on a gray morning that smelled of salt and diesel fuel. He took a train to Ohio, watching the American landscape scroll past the window. Farmland, small towns, church steeples, all of it impossibly peaceful, impossibly intact. Ellen was waiting for him at the Dayton station. She looked older than he remembered, or perhaps he was simply seeing her clearly for the first time in 3 years. She wore a blue dress and a nervous smile, and when she hugged him, she whispered, "I saved all your letters." They were married in March 1946, in the same church where they had first met as teenagers. Thomas's parents attended, along with Ellen's family and a handful of friends who had survived the war. There was a small reception afterward, with rationed cake and homemade decorations, and Thomas danced with his new wife to a song on the radio, holding her close, saying nothing. He took a job at a radio manufacturing plant in Dayton, using his military experience to land a position in the engineering department. The work was mundane, designing consumer electronics, improving production efficiency, nothing classified or critical. Thomas did not mind. He had spent enough time listening to the sounds of war. He was ready for the sounds of peace. But the war followed him in ways he had not anticipated. At night, he would sometimes wake suddenly, certain he had heard a pattern in the darkness, a rhythm beneath the silence, a signal buried in noise. He would lie still, heart pounding, straining to hear something that was not there. Ellen learned not to ask about these episodes. She would simply place her hand on his chest until his breathing slowed, and then they would both pretend to sleep until morning. He never spoke about his work on Saipan or the Philippine Sea. When his children, a daughter born in 1948, a son in 1951, asked what he had done in the war, he told them he had been a radio operator. This was true. It was also not the whole truth. In 1962, Thomas received a letter from the Department of Defense. Certain records from the Pacific War were being declassified, the letter explained, and his contributions were now eligible for formal acknowledgement. Would he be interested in attending a ceremony in Washington, D.C., along with other veterans whose wartime service was being recognized? Thomas read the letter twice, then placed it in a drawer and did not respond. He did not want ceremonies. He did not want acknowledgement. He wanted what he had: a wife who loved him, children who were healthy and happy, a job that paid the bills, a house with a backyard where he could grow tomatoes in the summer. But some memories could not be filed away in drawers. In 1987, Thomas Mercer was 68 years old. He had retired from the manufacturing plant 5 years earlier and spent his days gardening, reading, and occasionally helping neighbors repair their televisions and radios. Ellen had passed away in 1984 after a brief illness, and Thomas lived alone in the house they had shared for nearly 4 decades. One afternoon in October, his grandson, Ellen's daughter's son, a boy named Michael who was studying electrical engineering at Ohio State, came to visit. Michael was writing a paper on the history of military communications and wanted to interview his grandfather about his experiences in the Signal Corps. Thomas agreed, reluctantly. He made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and answered Michael's questions with the same careful brevity he had always used when discussing the war. Yes, he had been a radio operator. Yes, he had served in the Pacific. Yes, he had been involved in intelligence work, though he could not discuss specifics. Michael, who had done his research, pushed gently. "Grandpa, I found some declassified documents at the library. Your name is mentioned in a report about signals intelligence during the Marianas campaign. It says you developed a technique for intercepting noise-masked transmissions." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the October wind rattled the last leaves on the oak tree in the backyard. "That was a long time ago," he said finally. "Can you tell me about it?" Thomas looked at his grandson, this young man with his eager eyes and his notebook and his digital recorder, so confident that the past could be understood if only you asked the right questions. "There was a battle," Thomas said slowly, "a big one. The Japanese had found a way to hide their communications, and we could not hear them anymore. None of our equipment worked, and you fixed it. I built something, a receiver, different from the standard equipment." Thomas paused, remembering the supply tent behind the latrines, the kerosene lamp, the long hours with no sleep. "Everyone said it would not work. They said I was wasting my time, but I knew, I had listened to them for so long, I knew there had to be a pattern. You cannot communicate without patterns, it is impossible. So you found the pattern?" "Yes." Thomas's voice was very soft now. "I found it, and I wrote down everything I heard, and I gave it to the people who could do something about it, and they did." Michael waited, recorder running, sensing there was more. "There was a battle," Thomas repeated. "We won. A lot of men did not die because we knew where the enemy was. That is what they told me afterward. A lot of men did not die." He stopped. His hands, resting on the kitchen table, were trembling slightly. the same trembling he had noticed on the Lexington 43 years earlier. "But I heard them," he continued, "the Japanese. I heard their pilots talking to their carriers, and their carriers talking to their admirals. I could not understand the words, but I heard the voices. And then later, I heard the silence. When the transmissions stopped coming, when there was nothing left to hear." He looked up at his grandson. "That is what I remember most, Michael. Not the victory, not the medal they gave me, the silence. Because every silent frequency was a pilot who was not talking anymore, a ship that was not sailing, men who were not going home." Michael did not know what to say. He turned off the recorder. Thomas reached across the table and patted his grandson's hand. "I am not sorry for what I did. If I had not done it, other men would have died instead. American men, boys like you. War makes you choose, and I made my choice, but I want you to understand something." "What?" "The enemy was not a frequency. The enemy was not static. The enemy was people, just like us, following orders, believing what they had been told, trying to survive. And when you listen to someone long enough, really listen, you start to hear them. Not just their words, them, their fear, their hope, their humanity." Thomas stood up and walked to the window. The oak trees swayed in the wind. "I heard them," he said quietly. "And then I helped kill them. And I have been listening to that silence ever since." They sat together until the afternoon light faded, grandson and grandfather saying nothing more. Some things could not be explained in interviews or recorded for papers. Some things could only be carried. Thomas Mercer died in 1994 at the age of 75. He was buried beside Ellen in the cemetery near the church where they had married, under a headstone that listed his name, his dates, and a single line: "He listened." Michael, who had become an engineer specializing in radio astronomy, attended the funeral with his parents and his own young daughter. Afterward, he visited the house one last time to help sort through his grandfather's belongings. In the bottom drawer of an old desk in the basement, he found a box. Inside were 3 worn notebooks filled with cramped handwriting, frequencies, timestamps, observations, notes that had been made on a Pacific island 50 years earlier, when a young sergeant from Ohio had taught himself to hear what no one else could hear. Michael donated the notebooks to a museum dedicated to World War II communications history. They remain there today, behind glass, alongside photographs of the modified receiver that Thomas Mercer built from salvaged parts and determination. The placard beside them reads, "These notebooks represent the work of Technical Sergeant Thomas A. Mercer, whose innovative signals intelligence techniques contributed to the American victory at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1944. Sergeant Mercer received no public recognition for his contributions until after his death." What the placard does not say, what no placard could say, is that those notebooks represent something more than military intelligence. They represent a man learning to listen, to patterns, to enemies, to the weight of silence. And they remind us that in war, as in life, the most important signals are often the ones buried deepest beneath the noise. If this story moved you, help it reach more people by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Share in the comments what touched you most and from which country you are watching. These memories stay alive when we tell them together. The men and women of World War II faced impossible choices, and the stories of their courage, their sacrifice, and their humanity deserve to be remembered. Until next time, thank you for listening.